Today we are looking at a case from the early 20th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Elsie Paroubek was born in Chicago in 1906. Her parents, Franciszek and Karolina, had migrated to the USA from Eastern Bohemia, which at the time was part of the Austria-Hungary Empire, but is now situated within the present-day Czech Republic. Although they gave their children names from their homeland, everyone always referred to Elsie as Elsie, and Franciszek was known as Frank. Life for Czech-speaking immigrants in early 20th century Chicago was a blend of challenges and opportunities. Many settled in tight-knit communities, where they were able to communicate to friends and neighbours in their own language and preserve their cultural identity. However, they worked hard and contributed to the city's industrial and economic growth. Elsie's father worked as a painter, while her mother stayed at home to look after the large family. It was not unusual for young children to play outdoors without adult supervision. Streets and vacant lots were sometimes used as their playgrounds, and they would often walk alone along paths to visit a relative or a friend. Elsie Paroubek did this on the morning of Saturday the 8th of April 1911. She left her home at 2320 South Albany Avenue in Chicago, intending to visit her auntie, a lady named Mrs. Julia Trampotta, who lived nearby at 2325 South Troy Street. As Elsie made her way towards her aunt's house, she saw her 9-year-old cousin, a young girl named Josie, who was with other children, watching an organ grinder. They all seemed quite fascinated by the music, and Elsie stayed to listen. When the organ grinder finished, he moved on to the corner of 23rd Street, and most of the children followed. But for some reason, Elsie did not go with them. Several hours later, Mrs. Karolina Paroubek went to her sister's house to fetch her daughter, but was told that Elsie had not been there. Mrs. Paroubek was very surprised, but she knew that Elsie had many friends who lived nearby, so wondered if she might have visited one of their houses and fallen asleep. However, as the hours passed, she couldn't shake off her growing unease. At 9 p.m. that evening, Frank Paroubek arrived home from work, but before he had time to sit down, his wife told him that Elsie had gone out and not come back. He was immediately concerned and wasted no time in heading to the police station in Hinman Street to report his daughter as missing. However, strangely, the police didn't share his urgency. Instead, they agreed with his wife's theory that it was most likely that Elsie had fallen asleep at a friend's house. But when morning came, Elsie was still missing. Mr. Paroubek returned to the police station, where Police Captain John Mahoney acknowledged the gravity of the situation and assumed the leadership in the search. He instructed his officers to spare no effort in their quest to locate the missing young girl. Detectives were contacted from different police stations, and a thorough investigation began. As news spread that Elsie was missing, a boy named John Jirosky informed officers of a peculiar sighting that he had witnessed. According to John, he had seen a Romany wagon on Kedzie Avenue, which was located just 1 block west of Troy Street. He said that in the wagon were 2 women, one of whom was holding a young girl that fitted Elsie's description. Acting on this information, the police turned their attention to a nearby area where Romany people had settled in their wagons, close to the river. They spoke to the residents of these camps and soon discovered that one of the wagons had packed up and left on the morning of the 9th of April. The police now believed that Elsie had been taken by someone from the Romany community, probably so she could be put to work, begging on the streets. This theory soon gained traction due to the striking parallels between Elsie's disappearance and a previous incident involving a young child named Lillian Wolfe. Lillian had been taken away some 4 years earlier, but later found after a police investigation. In a desperate attempt to locate his daughter, Elsie's father offered his life savings, a sum of $50, as a reward for any information leading to her safe return. Not wanting to leave any stone unturned, the police chief ordered the dragging of the drainage canals, as he feared that Elsie may have fallen in and drowned. There was also a plea to the public, asking for assistance in the search efforts. Around this time, a 14-year-old girl named Emma Kubat, who lived in the same street as the Paroubeks, informed officers that she had last seen the little girl in the company of an organ grinder. Detectives immediately went to the Italian Quarter, located at West 14th and South Halstead Streets. They searched many properties, but their inquiries yielded no substantial information. The organ grinder theory was not pursued any further. On the 12th of April, a photograph of Elsie that had been enhanced by an artist appeared in the newspapers. She was described as small, with light golden hair and blue eyes. When she disappeared, she had been wearing a red one-piece dress, lace shoes, and black stockings. Her image was also printed in the subsequent editions of the newspapers, and this served as a reminder of the ongoing search and kept Elsie in the forefront of people's minds. But as the days passed without any significant breakthrough, the anguish of the Paroubek family deepened. On the 17th of April, the newspapers featured not only a full-length photo of Elsie, but also images of her parents, Frank and Carolina, as well as Carolina's sister, Julia. There was also a message from the police asking the community to be vigilant. As police returned to the taken by someone from the Romani community theory, Frank Paroubek accompanied detectives to try and find the wagon that the police believed Elsie may have been travelling in. It was reported that it may now be in Round Lake, Illinois, a small town situated approximately 50 miles northwest of Chicago. Local farmers were informed and asked to keep an eye out for the arrival of any Romani wagons and any sign of the missing girl. However, instead of cooperating with the authorities, some of the farmers took matters into their own hands. They confronted the Romani community, even attempting unauthorized searches of their property. Amidst the chaos, many of them left the camp and headed to the village of Volo in Lake County. Soon after, there are reports that a child, that many residents believed to be Elsie, had been seen in a Romani wagon. It was said that the child appeared to be disorientated or possibly under the influence of a substance, and that efforts had been made to hide her under a blanket. Local people again tried to search the wagons, but this only resulted in them moving on again, this time to the city of McHenry, approximately 50 miles northwest of Chicago. The police eventually intercepted the wagon that they had been looking for, but the saga ended with a disappointing revelation. The little girl in question was in fact a member of the Romani community and bore little resemblance to Elsie. Authorities now seem to be out of ideas as to where the missing girl might be. On the 17th of April, Police Captain Mahoney received an anonymous phone call informing him that a child matching Elsie's description had been seen accompanying a man in a hotel in Western Springs in Illinois. Detectives were promptly dispatched, but unfortunately, yet again their search yielded no results. Meanwhile, reporters questioned the police regarding a ransom note that had allegedly been sent to Carolina Paroubek, demanding $500 for the safe release of Elsie. Although officials neither confirmed or denied that the note existed, they did acknowledge the possibility of its authenticity. However, they did confirm that just a few days after Elsie had vanished, her father Frank started to receive anonymous, insulting letters that had been written in English. The letters accused the family of mistreating Elsie and claimed that she was hidden by someone who hated them. This had very much enraged Frank, and against the advice of detectives, he had burnt the letters. 3 days later, on the 20th of April, Elsie's 6-year-old brother Frank Jr. was seen with a pick and shovel digging in South Troy Street. When questioned, he said that men had been working on the road when his sister went missing, and he had overheard his parents saying that Elsie might have fallen into a hole and been buried under falling sand and gravel. Workers were asked about this, but they assured authorities that they would have noticed any such incidents. Reports of a fair-haired girl bearing a resemblance to Elsie and travelling alongside the Romani community persisted. But despite each sighting being thoroughly investigated, it was constantly confirmed that none of the children seen by officers were the missing girl. 11-year-old Lillian Wolfe stepped forward to offer her assistance. Having experienced abduction and 6 days of captivity herself, She possessed valuable insights into the behaviours and customs of the Romani community. One of Lillian's former captors, who was now in prison, recommended that officers spoke to Elijah George, a respected figure within the Romani community. Police traced him to Argyle in Wisconsin, but when questioned by detectives, he was not very cooperative and said that he knew nothing of the missing child. Inspector Healy now wondered if Elsie really had been abducted and ordered a search of the drainage canal and other possible locations where Elsie might have fallen. Despite the ongoing search and numerous reported sightings, none led to the discovery of the missing girl. By the 23rd of April, Lieutenant John Costello declared that all leads in the suspected kidnapping had been exhausted. He feared that Elsie had been harmed and her body hidden in a nearby cellar or barn. Search teams were organised and detectives inspected various buildings for potential hiding spots. The Romani community wagons were monitored and alerts issued to neighbouring police departments. Sightings of Elsie continued to be reported, and a person came forward who said that after seeing the young girl with the organ grinder on the day she vanished, she was then seen again, only this time talking to an unfamiliar man. Newspapers continued to report the story on a daily basis, so it was always kept in the public's mind. The Chicago Daily News described the search efforts as one of the most extensive and far-reaching quests ever made for a missing child. The Czech community in Chicago came together to show solidarity with the Paroubeks. Mayor Carter Harrison Jr. and Alderman Anton Cermak took proactive steps by offering rewards for any information leading to finding the little girl. Lieutenant Costello still believed that she may have accidentally fallen into a nearby drainage canal, and this prompted a renewed focus on the area. However, no signs of the missing child were discovered. It was now a month since Elsie had disappeared, and on the 7th of May, Police Captain Mahoney reached a chilling conclusion that the young girl was dead. Despite this grim reality, he vowed to relentlessly pursue the search for her, refusing to yield until justice was served and closure attained. 2 days later, on the 9th of May 1911, at the Lockport Power Plant, 35 miles outside of Chicago, an electrical engineer named George T. Scully spotted something floating in the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. Initially thinking it was an animal from a nearby farm, along with colleagues, he went out to retrieve it, but they were all horrified to discover that it was in fact the body of a young girl. They noticed the striking similarities between the body they had found and the description of the missing child, Elsie Paroubek, who they had read about in the newspapers. The authorities were contacted, and Police Lieutenant Costello informed Mr. and Mrs. Paroubek. Elsie's father, Frank, was then asked to identify the body. However, he initially struggled to recognise the young deceased girl as his daughter. In a heart-wrenching turn, Carolina, his wife, stepped forwards, and upon viewing the deceased child, she confirmed that the body was that of Elsie. Arrangements were swiftly made for an inquest to be held at the funeral parlour, presided over by the coroner William Wunderlich, and a jury comprising of various members of the community. Frank Paroubek appeared as a witness and told that he had no doubt that his daughter had been murdered. He asserted through a translator that Elsie had been abducted and then killed, and the perpetrator of this terrible crime had later disposed of her body in the canal. Carolina was overcome with grief and fled the inquest, claiming that Elsie had been murdered. Despite efforts from her husband and detectives to calm her, she ran through the streets, shouting, "Someone killed my daughter." Two physicians, Dr. E.A. Kingston and Dr. W.R. Paddock, confirmed the absence of water in Elsie's lungs, ruling out drowning as a cause of death. Dr. Kingston stated that Elsie had been attacked and murdered prior to being dumped in the water, while Dr. Paddock noted signs of wounding before she had died. They also believed that the body had been in the water for about 2 weeks. Lieutenant Costello told the press that he believed Elsie had been mistreated and suggested that the perpetrators weren't from the Romani community. He also stated that Elsie was abused before she died. Newspapers reported that Elsie had been strangled, but an examination by Dr. E.R. LeCount, and Dr. Warren H. Hunter concluded that she had suffocated. However, contrary to the findings of Dr. Kingston and Dr. Paddock, Dr. LeCount and Dr. Hunter found no clear signs of violence on her body. Coroner Peter Hoffman agreed that the child had been suffocated and urged further investigation into the case. Inspector Healy announced that 40 detectives are investigating the theory that the person who committed this crime resided in the neighbourhood where the little girl had lived. He said that the police had scrutinised every aspect of the Paroubek family's history since their arrival in Chicago, with the aim of uncovering any potential adversaries they may have. Strangely, he then expressed his confidence in the swift apprehension of the person who took the life of Elsie, and stated that it would be a surprise to him if they were not arrested within a week. The funeral was held on the 12th of May and was attended by nearly 3,000 mourners. It began at the Paroubek lawn, with people filling the streets and watching from bedroom windows. A solemn atmosphere prevailed. Elsie's small white coffin was adorned with flowers and surrounded by young girls holding bouquets. Carolina requested a final glimpse of her daughter, but relatives convinced her to let the undertaker proceed. The procession then moved to the Bohemian National Cemetery. The funeral was covered extensively in the media, and Police Chief John McWeeny announced that the Chicago Police Department would make all its resources available to make sure they apprehended the perpetrator of this most terrible act. The reward for information was also increased. Newspapers reported that the police suspected Elsie's death had resulted from falling into a drainage canal near Kenzie Avenue Bridge. Apparently, after Elsie's body had been pulled from the canal, the first physician who had seen her told Lieutenant Costello that he believed that her death had been caused by drowning and that there were no marks to suggest that she had been abused. However, the later autopsy confirmed that she was already deceased before being placed in the water, a conclusion supported by the coroner and 4 other doctors. However, Lieutenant Costello and many of his law enforcement colleagues still believe that the initial findings from the first doctor were probably more accurate. Despite this, detectives still tried to find Elsie's killer and now focused on the area where her body had been discovered. They soon started to suspect a man named Joseph Canesti, who was described as a bearded bohemian and a hermit peddler. It was alleged that this man lured young girls to his dwelling near the drainage canal on West 33rd Street and South Kedzie Avenue, which was close to the Paroubek residence. A search of his shack uncovered potential evidence, including a green hair ribbon. There were also signs of a shallow excavation and the presence of an aged hemp sack, which detectives believed could have potentially concealed a body. When police spoke to the shack owner, a man named David Shaughnessy, he told them that he had evicted Mr. Canesti on the 9th of May, as he was concerned with his interactions with children. However, detectives were unable to interview the suspect, as he took his own life by throwing himself in front of a train on the 10th of May, which was the day after Elsie's body had been discovered. On the 15th of May, the police announced that they did not believe that Joseph Canesti had been responsible for Elsie's death, but they gave no more information as to how they had come to that conclusion. The body of a well-dressed man was discovered in the Willow Springs Canal, bearing only a Polish prayer card inscribed Sig Hoff, and this prompted detectives to explore potential connections to Elsie's death. An anonymous letter that detailed the sighting of a girl with an unknown man by the canal on the day of Elsie's disappearance added intrigue. However, police failed to ascertain the identity of the deceased person and again ruled him out as a suspect. Another individual, named Mr. Kinsella, who was said to be a religious enthusiast and was possibly mentally unstable, emerged as a person of interest. When approached by detectives, he fled, prompting a pursuit that culminated into his escape into the wilderness. Mr. Kinsella was not spoken to by the police again. Detectives also looked for a man who had previously lodged in the Paroubek household, and they continued to try to identify the person who had sent the malicious letters to Elsie's father. However, neither the former tenant or the sender of the letters was ever located. The trail for finding the killer eventually went cold and was first scaled down and then stopped. This meant that the perpetrator of this most horrible crime remained elusive and would probably never be brought to justice. 2 years later, on the 12th of May 1913, the anniversary of Elsie's funeral, Mr. Frank Paroubek passed away at the age of 45. His wife Carolina died 14 years later, on the 9th of December 1927. Both Frank and Carolina were laid to rest alongside Elsie in the Bohemian National Cemetery. For the next 46 years, the murder lingered as a haunting mystery until the passing of Henry Darger in 1973. Henry Darger was an artist known for his strange and imaginative creations, who left behind a body of work that bears intriguing connections to the unsolved case of Elsie Paroubek. He himself was a reclusive figure who spent much of his life in obscurity, working as a custodian in Chicago. It was only after his death that the extent of his artistic output was discovered, thanks to Michael Bonesteel, an art historian who examined his work. There was a vast collection of paintings, collages, and a sprawling book titled The Story of the Vivian Girls. This was accompanied by intricate illustrations. Henry Darger was 19 years old when Elsie disappeared, and the fascination with the case was evident in his art, though he never explicitly acknowledged it. Themes of innocence, violence, and the quest for justice resonate throughout his writings and drawings, bearing an eerie resemblance to the events surrounding Elsie's disappearance and subsequent murder in 1911. In his book, The Story of the Vivian Girls, repeated references are made about the main character, Annie Arnonberg, who is the leader of a child slave rebellion and met a shocking yet heroic death at the hands of her captors, although it bears no resemblance to Elsie's tragic fates. However, according to his diary, Henry Darger had lost a picture of a young girl and was desperately seeking to replace it. Though he didn't provide the name, he mentioned that it had appeared in the Chicago Daily Noise in May, June or July of 1911. A search of the newspaper archives by researchers revealed a picture of Elsie at the time. Intriguingly, a portrait of Annie Arnonberg by Henry Darger depicts a somewhat older blonde-haired girl wearing a hair ribbon, and the distinctive collar of her dress resembles that of Elsie's in the photograph. While the exact nature of his connection to the case remains speculative, there are some who believe that he may have been responsible for the crime, while others point to the fact that he was an advocate for child protection, and it is more likely that he was merely inspired by Elsie's story and a striking photo in the newspaper. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.